Hi, my name is Madeline Gannon. I'm an artist and designer based in the US, and I talk to robots a lot. In today's master's class, I'm going to talk about the future of humans and machines, and how artists and designers are working to forge new futures by mixing art and technology to deciding how these machines will actually live with us. Yes, my name is Madeline Gannon. I'm absolutely delighted to be here with you all in Barcelona in this amazing setting to spend 90 minutes talking about robots. Very exciting. Why don't we start, since we're here together for such a long time, let's sort of talk about the agenda that I had for today. To start off with some introductions, and then talk a little bit about how we got to now. So I wanted to bring some historical context into where we stand today and how we got to where we stand today with our relationship with machines. And then I figured it would be worthwhile to spend a little bit of time trying to cut through the hype. There's a lot of hype around robotics, especially when you talk about AI. And so let's just show, what's real, what's overhyped, and how do we figure this out together, this messiness together going into the future. And then this is really what I want to spend a lot of time on with you all today, is talking about our preferable futures, where we want to go next with these machines. And then I wanted to leave you with a couple of resources and references for after the class, in case you wanted to take a deeper dive into some of the subject area. And then lastly, I have an open Q&A, and what I'm hoping to do here is not necessarily for you guys to ask me questions, but that we can have a little bit of a dialogue with each other, since I imagine there's a lot of different backgrounds and expertise in this room, and I think that we can learn from each other just as much as me talking. So let's start with some introductions. My name is Madeline Gannon. I spent a lot of time talking to robots, but the way I got there was kind of circuitous. I'm a designer, a researcher, an artist, and a scientist. My background is originally in architecture, but what I got really interested in was trying to figure out how to digitally design and make things. And where that really took me from day one was thinking about 3D printing and how to talk to computers first before robots. So I've built software that lets you design these wearables around a scan of your own body. I've built interfaces that let you actually interact with your own body and touch and poke and prod these digital, live, animate designs that you can actually interact with and convert that into a 3D model that then you can print. So here, for example, I'm detecting some of my hand gestures and some of the touch gestures on my skin to design a bracelet that then can go into a smartwatch to fit in. So in working with 3D printers, this amazing advanced manufacturing technology was great. These are 3-axis machines that you control with geometry, and it makes a thing. And kind of the granddaddy, the big kahuna of all of these machines is an industrial robot, right? An industrial robot you control with geometry, and you tell it where to go, and it makes a thing. And I was in a fortunate enough situation to gain access to this amazing tool. But because of my background, I didn't initially approach it from the perspective of automation. I thought about it from the perspective of interaction. And that's not particularly common yet with these machines that are supposed to do what they're told to do and nothing else but that. And that's kind of taking me around the world, creating these interactive installations that really help us recontextualize our relationship to this automation infrastructure in hopefully a more inclusive way. So I'll talk about these projects a little more in detail as we go through the talk, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of background about me and how I think about these things before we spend this 90 minutes together. So for this talk, this is sort of the things that I'd like us to sort of walk away with at the end of the 90 minutes, thinking about where are we going, and where would we like to go with our future with machines. So I thought it'd be best to begin at the beginning and really think about definitions. So what is a robot in the most general sense? And so when you think of a robot, sometimes maybe you think of something like Osimo here, this sort of animatronic demonstrator. Or maybe you've seen and thought about C-3PO from Star Wars, kind of iconic robot figure. Or maybe you have thought about some of the incredible and sometimes unnerving, really advanced research labs are producing these amazing robots that sort of take the internet by storm every time there's a video. I want to think about this in a more general way. So I think that these are very narrow definitions of what a robot is, but it still tends to be what we hold in our mind. So for this class, I'd like you to think about a robot as anything with a mechanical mind and anything with mechanical muscles. It's a much more broad definition. And when we use that expanded definition, we can see that there's plenty of robots that are already living alongside us. So anything from robots in factories and warehouses to robots in our cities, in our streets, in our skies. If you've been in a hospital recently, you've probably bumped into a robot that is maybe even delivering medicine or delivering towels or materials to a nurse in a particular room. Maybe even own a robot that's cleaning your home right now, or at least entertaining you. But our history with robotics is the discipline as a whole really started in the 1950s, the modern robots that we have today. So it's a very young discipline, still trying to figure things out. But our desire to breathe animacy into the inanimate and to breathe consciousness into the unconscious really goes back to the root of our civilization. All the way back to the 15th century in Egypt, there were people trying to figure out how to make statues sing or make these mechanisms that went into temples that would embody what the gods would do. And we see this from Egypt to Greece to the Middle East, and even China as well. All of these desires to sort of make these mechanisms that enchant us and that speak to us towards what's happening in the heavens. So these are ancient automaton, not quite robots yet, right? They have muscles, but they have no minds. And it's not until the 18th century, the 19th century, where we really start to see the basics of what we can consider today as the ancestor of the modern robot. So this is a really incredible project, the Mechanical Turk, developed in the 1770s. And it's a machine, you see the mechanism here, that plays chess against you. And what's quite novel about that is people were so enamored about the fact that this machine could actually defeat them at chess, but in reality, there was a person stuffed inside, sort of playing along with it. And then on the other side of this is the Jacquard Loom, made maybe 40 years later. And this is not only sort of the shared ancestor between robots as well as computers. So this device here, which is a mechanical way to design intricate patterns in woven products, woven textiles, is actually was the inspiration for programmable computers. I love this diagram, right? So this is how this chess master, illustrious chess master sort of stuffed into a box to reach around and play chess. But this also talks about a lot of what we see today in how we mark intelligence for machines and computers. So you could see this in Deep Blue versus Kasparov, and more recently, about 20 years later, in AlphaGo versus Lee Sedol, right? So we have this desire and this kind of interesting metric that a computer is not smart until it beats us at a game. And for the Jacquard Loom, what was really interesting about this is that this was, again, kind of the direct ancestor of programmable memory in a machine. So those same cards that would do intricate patterns, this is somewhat indistinguishable between a robot and a computer at this point. It's all these mechanical systems and mechanical knobs that are making this logic. If we go a little bit forward to some of the early robots, we can see in pop culture, how many of you guys are familiar with Forbidden Planet? 1950s movie, yeah? This, Rosie in particular, is sort of in our mind as the iconic robot. This is the robot that everyone wants to have in their home. From robots in Lost in Space and robots again from R2-D2 and C-3PO, this is kind of the foundation of, even today, a lot of roboticists that are working today saw these science fiction films in the past and they got inspired to make them real. So these narratives from 60 years ago are still really driving what people think about our future. It's kind of an old vision of the future, no? At the same time, artists were starting to get involved with what machines can do. And there were two really big groups. One in Europe, this is an exhibition called Cybernetic Serendipity from 1968. And this project in particular is one of my absolute favorites from Edward and Nakowitz. It's called Sound Activated Mobile. And this is a hydraulic robot that hears with its big ears and goes and looks at what's happening. And then this is an art collective based in the US, EAT, Experiments in Art and Technology. And they were very active, and they've actually restarted again as a collective in thinking about how do we combine art and engineering together. Bell Labs was one of the big funders for it. This project from Robert Breer was really wonderful, kind of like the world's biggest Roomba in these floaties that we had. Let me go back one. These things here actually have a little car underneath 3 wheels that they would drive around very, very slowly in the plaza. So at the same time that we have these narratives in science fiction and pop culture and these actual living things coming to life in art and technology, in industry, we were starting to see sort of the very first ways of making things with machines. This here is the first program. It's not a computer-controlled program. It's not a CNC machine. It's a numerically controlled program. So it's still using those punch cards. But it was the first time that we could design something with a computer and get it out into the physical world. And it wasn't too long after that until we started to see, this is the world's first industrial robot, the Younameit. And that went on the line for General Motors in the early 70s, 1971. And began to be the first robot to work alongside people on a factory line. And it was doing very dangerous things, mostly with die casting, so picking up things that are really, really hot and putting them into things that are really, really crushing, things that people really shouldn't be doing. When we go forward into sort of the modern era today, the narrative around robotics has slightly shifted, right? So in the 1980s, we had this era of cyberpunk in science fiction and pop culture, where the robots that we see on film and TV actually look like us, but they're enhanced with these superhuman abilities. And then with these examples, and these are only a couple examples out of the vast body of work in science and pop culture at this time, but what I find interesting is there's this allegorical trope to most of these forms of storytelling. So it's man creates machine in his own image. Machine surpasses man. Man must destroy machine or be destroyed by machine. Right? It's a very, very common idea that's very human-centric in our own anxieties about where we stand in life. If we jump back to industry today, we see that there are many, many advancements that have happened in industrial robotics and factory automation and manufacturing. So this is a continuation of what's been happening in the mid-20th century. But there's a lot more interesting things that are happening where now the factory is actually moving around. It's not the materials going down the factory is coming to you. And mobile robots in particular are becoming kind of essential for logistics infrastructure, for warehouses, and we're starting to see in package delivery as well. But that's not the only thing that robots have started to sort of proliferate a lot of aspects of our daily life. So in medical applications, there's surgical robots that have been around for 20 years. Here we see a person practicing building a paper airplane with these devices. We're also starting to see wearable robots that are used for stroke rehabilitation or gait rehabilitation, like robots that you can actually wear that help you gain some of your mobility or strengthen after an injury. And then also assistive robotics. So this example is a Jaco Canova arm. It attaches onto a wheelchair, and it helps people with limited mobility begin to reach things in cabinets or begin to extend their reach beyond the limits of their own body. So not just industry and medical applications, we're also seeing domestic applications. So probably the most well-known robot in the world is maybe Roomba. Does anyone own a Roomba here? Anyone? Yeah, that's pretty impressive. That's pretty impressive, right? So these domestic robots give a promise to do a chore for us and make our lives better. And then also a theme is social robots. So these robots, they're not particularly useful, right? They don't clean stuff for us, but they just keep us company. They help fight the loneliness. They help make our life more delightful. And then some of the medical applications and assistive technology have shrunk down to size so that we can have these tools in our homes, like this robotic spoon, for example, from Liftware, that if you have tremors with your hand, it stabilizes that so you can actually feed yourself and you don't need someone to feed you. I find domestic robots really interesting, right? Because, this is kind of the expectation and the image that we've been fed all of our lives for what robots should be in our home. And this is kind of the reality of what they are to us. And for me, in my life, I really think that this is far more interesting, right? This is a much better, more interesting conclusion than kind of this Rosie over here. And so I'm trying to find the kind of like wonderful and weird that we can sort of like push the normal towards. So just to kind of summarize of this section, a robot is anything with a mechanical mind, anything with mechanical muscles. If you hold on to that definition, you'll start to see more and more of them in our homes, in our cities, in our offices. And it's pretty incredible how powerful storytelling from the mid-20th century, storytelling from half a century ago, has greatly shaped our expectations for what we want robots to be. And there's a legacy of robotics in industry that used for automation in particular that still begins to shape our modern applications, right? So a robot is not useful unless it's efficient, unless it's optimized, unless it's automated. And that's still kind of a lot of the expectation for what robots are today. But I think that our modern realities, where we are today, is actually a lot more stranger and a lot more interesting than what we have imagined or what we could have imagined back in the 1950s. So let's spend a little bit of time in cutting through the hype. There's a lot of talk about robotics, there's a lot of talk about AI in robotics, and so I just wanted to see what's hype. What are we hopeful for, and what's actually happening in the research community that is coming out into the world? So let's start with kind of a general definition of AI, artificial intelligence. There's a lot of definitions out there. If you go search the internet, it's kind of convoluted subject matter. But I think a good way of, again, abstracting away the complexity is thinking of artificial intelligence as a way to make mechanical minds more adaptable to change. And artificial intelligence, so you're sort of teaching a computer to recognize and react to patterns of data. And these AI systems, they use machine learning algorithms to synthesize information. So AI is a system of algorithms. Machine learning makes up the majority of those algorithms. And they are what enable a computer, a mechanical mind, to see signal from noise. And they're particularly useful for recognizing patterns in large data sets. So when you combine the two, when you combine AI and robotics, you have this more adaptable mechanical mind with this more adaptable mechanical muscles, and it helps a robot brain sort of generalize and abstract away information. So as a programmer of a robot, I don't have to tell it to do every single thing. And if I don't program it to do something very, very specific, it doesn't fall down the stairs like Osimo, right? It's able to recognize something that it hasn't been explicitly programmed to do and adapt to it slightly. So artificial intelligence and machine learning has been really fundamental to how robots have gotten better at seeing, reasoning, and moving through the world. And so these are all examples of things that happen inside a computer in the robot's brain and then are physicalized through the world. So artificial intelligence and machine learning is really great for object detection, facial recognition, pose detection, and localization. A lot of these have to do with machine vision, how it sees the world and how it understands what it's seeing. And then there are still things that are really, really challenging, but have seen a lot of improvement by artificial intelligence coming into robotics. So simulation in particular is really, really hard. We can simulate a perfect world and run robots through those simulations many, many times faster than if they were physical worlds. But the hardware itself is not as perfect as the simulation. And that's where hardware compensation comes in. So we can simulate noise in these sensors and actually try to get it towards a more perfect realization. This is a project from NVIDIA where they're doing artificial intelligence to make denoising. What this allows them to do, and with a lot of robotics things, is to use really, really inexpensive hardware, cheap sensors that are very, very noisy and yet get meaningful information from them. And that's been very helpful in this sim to real challenge. So taking simulation and transferring it onto a real robot, right? That's kind of the golden standard for how you want to begin to train a machine and get it out into the world, is to do it in a computer and have it actually work on the hardware. And better simulation and better hardware compensation using AI has been really, really helpful moving towards that. Okay, so let's talk about what is hype and what is real here. When someone talks about AI and robotics, a lot of times they talk about it as kind of like this super intelligence, like we're building an AI. It's almost like this deity or this religion that we're creating, like man is creating God. We're not creating supreme beings. These things are just used for object detection, and walking around, hopefully. The other thing that is another common narrative in robotics is robots taking over humanity, our robot overlords coming. That's not our future yet. I don't see that we're on a path to there. Maybe it's a possibility, but for the most part, that is a lot of hype, right? So that's our own anxieties about our place in the world being put onto a robot. Mass automation, though, that's something that is real and that is happening, right? So this idea that AI-enabled software, AI-enabled hardware, robots, are beginning to automate labor at a really, really fast pace. That's actually happening in the world, right? That's actually real. And it's a problem that we need to begin to tackle. I'm hoping that the arts communities is one of those voices at that table that can find better ways forward towards having a more inclusive, human-centered future with robots. Another challenge is with all of these systems is that how do we know, if we're coming from a different discipline, right? We're not in robotics. How do we know what's hype and what is real? What's a potential future? You can read a lot of papers and learn a lot of journals, and kind of a shortcut to that is to look at where these different things that are coming through the media are actually getting funding from. So if the project has military funding, that tends to be a longer-term view or a long shot, a long bet of it actually becoming real in the world. And if something has venture capital funding, that tends to be something that is a shorter-term gain, that the technology is really stable, and maybe they're just working out a business model for it. So for a lot of these machines that are coming out, whether we should put a lot of faith in them being a near-term reality or a far-term reality, you can use this dichotomy to sort of sift through the noise. And the military is kind of interesting. With a lot of advanced technologies that take a long time to mature, the military, especially the US military, is the initiator of a lot of the funding for it. It's very problematic for that, but this is kind of what the research transfer life cycle of a project is. So if we look at exoskeletons, for example, exoskeletons started as a military-funded project, making these super soldiers. And then afterwards, it sort of miniaturized and found a specialized market. So here, for example, is in hospital applications and rehab applications. And then it finds a mass market. So this, for example, is a company called Exco that's making some hardware that goes onto workers. It's being used in Ford factories now to help them be more ergonomic and not really be stronger, but help them avoid some of the common industries for repetitive labor. Quadrupeds have sort of seen the same pattern too, four-legged robots. All of these are from Boston Dynamics. It started off as military research and funding, and then it found a specialized market. So there's a spot. This specialized market was selling to researchers. And now they're just trying to begin to commercialize this technology. Some of the applications that they're looking towards is like going onto construction sites and surveying where things are. It's a bit of a big transfer from military funding to hold ammo and guns and things in a wilderness to working side by people. And this is this pattern holds true for a lot of robotics companies that have been around for over 15 or 20 years. So this is the PackBot. Has anyone seen this robot before? Does anyone know what company made it? Well, a lot of you have it in your homes, admittedly. So this was actually how iRobot, the company that makes Roomba, got started. It started with military funding. They spun out, and they still have a military applications branch. But the core technology for PackBot was really implemented and matured in Roomba here, which is this whole methodology of not trying to fully understand the world, but only understand the world as it comes to you. So there are a lot of hard problems in robotics. And what they tend to be are things that we can do really, really well, tend to still be hard problems in robotics. So manipulation, walking, this is from a company called Agility Robotics that's making this bipeds. Multi-robot system, so you and I, we can pretty much collaborate and do a thing, but for multiple robots to do that, it's still really complicated. And social interaction. Now, social interaction is something I care a lot about, and it's not particularly technically hard. It's just that there's no right answer. There's no solution towards interacting with someone. There's a solution or the wrong solution, but there's no right way to do it. Versus walking, like you're either walking or you're not, you're falling over. So these have a lot of technical limits, but these are still things that the research community in general are still striving to tackle. So to break this down, just so we're sort of all clear on this definition, AI is a general approach to help computers understand and abstract patterns of data. It's not a superhuman. It's not going to take over the world. But it is helpful right now to begin to compensate for some of the limitations in hardware and software in machines. So AI can make cheap hardware more reliable, and it can make software more adaptable really quickly. And then a rule of thumb when you're trying to sift through yourself whether this amazing technology that's breaking news on some website is actually hype or real, you can look back into how it actually got funding. And if it's something that is military funded, then it's maybe like a 15 to 20 year outlook before that becoming more of a reality in the future. If it's venture capital funded, that's 5 to 10 years, maybe 3 to 5 years for something that's actually becoming real and applicable to our lives. Despite a lot of these rapid advancements, there's a lot of things that we all think as really easy, because we do it all the time, that's still really hard for machines to do. And those are active areas of research. And so the rate of innovation is changing very quickly in the research community, but there's still these challenges that are going to take a long time to actually happen. This is where I really want to spend a lot of time talking about what are the futures we would actually like to see with machines. And so I have a lot of examples here. I'll talk a little bit about my work in more detail, but I also want to share what other artists and designers are doing today to begin to think about what are different ways that we can begin to relate to machines in our daily lives. And so whenever we talk about the future, it's good to begin to sort of have a model imagination for what that actually looks like. And I particularly love this diagram from Stuart Candy, a futurist now based in the US, that's talking about the possible, probable, and preferable futures. We stand where we are today and we look out into the future, and the further out we look, the more options we have in that future. And that's sort of what he's showing here. There's a probable future that is kind of straight ahead of us that we can see a little more directly, a possible future that is really, really wide, and then a preferable that sort of is at the edge, at the fringe of what's possible and what's impossible. And the way that I like to think about this is that industry is really focused on, really targeted towards seeing probable futures. They have a blind spot for kind of all the other possibilities out there. Research takes a wider approach, trying to capture all the possible futures. And the arts is really what's there, is to begin to think about how do we get towards those preferable futures? How do we push on the edges of what's possible to sort of move the centroid away from this normative probable towards something that's a little more interesting? So as a society, we really have this resounding agreement about the futures that we don't want, right? We don't want robots to enslave us, and we don't want robots to replace us. But the harder question, and the thing that we have really collectively yet to decide, is thinking about what are the futures that we actually do want. It's a much, much harder question to answer. And so this is really at the heart of what I want to share with you today, is just thinking about how artists and designers are pushing at the edge of what's possible to sort of think about and probe new futures for humans and machines. And there's a couple of categories or ways to think about this that I think is useful. There's more possibilities in this, but these are the themes that I see emerging in my own work and the work of my friends and my colleagues. People thinking about robots as creatures, people thinking about robots as collaborators, people thinking about robots as extensions of our own body, and then people thinking about robots as actually dynamic environments. This is where I want to start today, robots as creatures. This is where a majority of my work lies. So up until now, we've done a pretty wide survey of things in the history and present of robotics, sort of sampling different projects. And what I want to do here is kind of take a deep dive into my work with you to share what I think about when I'm creating a piece, what tools I use, if you're interested in that, and some of the challenges that are innate to interactive robotics and how to overcome them. So I focus the majority of my work on industrial robots. There's a lot of really interesting robots out there, but I find these the most fascinating because they have this superhuman strength, this superhuman speed, this superhuman endurance, but they tend to live really, really boring lives, doing the same thing over and over, kind of trapped in this factory. They just have really short, repetitive tasks over and over. And what I find interesting as well as these machines in particular are our pillars of automation infrastructure, but they've also become to symbolize everything that we fear about robots as a society. You know, everything that we fear about our own obsolescence in life. And so the work that I do tries to find new ways around the future to recontextualize and reimagine what these tools of automation could be. I'm really passionate about inventing better ways to communicate with machines that can make things. For a long time, industrial robots have been the culprit of automation and replacing human labor. Basically, all the easy tasks to automate have been automated. Now what we're working on is using these tools to enhance or augment human labor. And that to me is very exciting. Industrial robots are really fantastic CNC machines. You put a different tool at the end of the arm and all of a sudden they can do a whole different thing. So in the morning you can be doing spot welding, in the evening you can be doing painting. It's just highly adaptable. Another thing that I'm working towards is finding ways to bring these machines out of factories and into live environments. So onto construction sites or onto film sets. There's chance for unpredictable objects like people to be moving into the environment. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to build the system, to give this robot eyes so that it could actually see me and we can safely collaborate in a shared space. If I'm wearing or if I'm holding these motion capture markers, it knows where I am in space, it knows how I'm moving in space. Now all of a sudden we can give the machine a nuanced understanding of our intention in that space. You can get someone who's never seen a robot before and have them begin to do creative things with just a couple minutes of interacting with the machine. So a lot of the work that I do is really about trying to get existing technology to do things that it was never intended to do. So here, I'm creating software that is trying to convince this machine designed to do short, repetitive tasks to go beyond its engineered purpose. So to be open, to be improvisational, and respond to me in ways that people are not really supposed to be this close to a machine. That is what I was trying to, the effect that I was trying to have on this robot. And after days and hours of programming this thing, I was a little shocked to notice the effect that this robot had on me. And what was interesting to me is that the more and more time I spent in front of this machine, I felt less and less like a roboticist, like a programmer, like an engineer, and I felt more and more like this. Like I was this sort of animal tamer coming face to face with this giant beast of a machine that could crush me at any second and hopefully wouldn't. And what was interesting too is that it wasn't just me. Other people saw this connection with just by the way I'm moving and the way the robot's moving. One day I got an invitation from a museum to sort of try to create this experience, not just between myself and this robot, but with a whole crowd of strangers and a robot, so that people could see that there are other alternatives in our life than standard automation. And so this ask from curator kind of reminded me of like Victorian era zoos, where people would bring strange and exotic creatures from around the world, captured and brought to strange places into this artificial environment as a means of our own spectacle and amazement. And so I thought that was an interesting metaphor to play on, right? Here's this exotic machine that we don't really see in our day-to-day life, and oftentimes people are having a very first encounter with them in this museum, very artificial setting for a robot. So I decided to give a robot here. This is Mimus, and she had a 6-month holiday from her factory job in Birmingham to come live in the Design Museum in London for the duration of the museum. And the goal of this was not just to have a robot in the museum for people to look at, but to really begin to think of this robot as a living thing that was excited to meet strangers and kind of curious, just as the people were. So let me introduce you to Mimus here. And the big challenge was like, how do you take this 1-ton pile of metal and motors and yet breathe life into it and bring it to become this mechanical creature? So just like any other zoo animal, I wanted Mimus to have a personality. I wanted her to be curious and sometimes even indifferent and bored of the people around her. So her job now was not to do a bunch of tasks. Her job was just to exist in the museum. And so this is a little bit of behind the scenes, the sort of technical development that went underway for that. So for the orange robot, there was one person with one robot, and it was very controlled. It was a lab environment. And we had to do a lot of work to get Mimus to be able to see a crowd of people. So unlike you or me, Mimus doesn't see us through our eyes. She sees through bird's eye view of the world. So there's depth sensors mounted all around her enclosure that looks down and sees a bunch of people there. And just with this information, this is actually what she sees, we can discern a lot of technical information that we can make into kind of qualitative decisions. So here we're seeing these blobs are people. We can see how tall they are, how long they've been there, how excited they're moving around. And we can begin to infer who might be the most interesting person for Mimus to go look at. So, for example, if I want Mimus to go look at kids more than adults, because adults are boring and kids are fun, then I might look for some of the shortest people that are moving around the most and sort of favor Mimus to go visit them first. And once Mimus knew who to go look at, because of course she has one body and can only pay attention to one person in this whole crowd of people, then she needs to move. And for that, I developed a body language that really tried to think of, if this machine were born in the wild, how would it move? How would it communicate with the world? So I really focused on 3 simple ingredients, just her posture, her motion, and her sound of her motors, as these innate tools of communication for broadcasting her intent to the world around her. So a lot of projects in robotics, they'll put like an iPad on the end of the robot and make a face. And I find that's very unnatural, right? The robots all have bodies. We communicate with our bodies, and so can these machines. And I think part of the strange appeal that we have with Mimas here is how something that is so alien to our own biology can still seem so lifelike still. And what this machine is doing, at least is what I think, is showing our own reflection, right? It's showing us our own humanity. When we can imagine emotion into machine, it's really saying more about us than it is the machine. When we see Mimas give this gentle nod or a curious sniff or an exuberant lunge towards something, we're really seeing our own emotions, our own anxieties, our own curiosities reflected projected onto her and then reflected back at us. She's showing us bits and pieces of our own humanity. And it's pretty incredible, right? When you look at something and it looks back at you, it's sort of, there's a connection there immediately. And as human beings, we have this kind of innate instinct that we're hardwired to connect with animate things. What really surprised me though, because again, I'm based in the US, this was in the UK, I was an ocean away, and yet it was really interesting to see the kind of range of emotions that Mimas would elicit, which wasn't necessarily the goal. So here you can hear the sound of her motors. And we focused a bit on the sound design here as well, right? So different motors move in a different way. The bigger motors at the lower part of the body make a rumble, almost like a snore. And at the end of the robot, their smaller motors move a lot faster, and they make this kind of chirp. And with that, another layer of, again, beginning to see this machine not as a piece of manufacturing equipment, but as a living, breathing thing. And then on top of this, right, so the goal was not really to prescribe how people should feel about it, but to give them an opportunity to think about the complexities of our own future with automation. And some people would look at this kind of big, loud, enthusiastic machine and find her particularly creepy, right? And why shouldn't they? It's kind of odd to see a piece of manufacturing equipment that is attentive and staring you down. And so Mimas was a project that explored what it was like for one robot to be surrounded by many people. And then a few years later, I had an opportunity to think about what would it be like for many robots to be surrounded by many people. So this project, Manus, was commissioned by the World Economic Forum, and they invited me to create an installation that spoke towards the fourth industrial revolution, which is all about, a future where intelligent autonomous machines are everywhere in manufacturing. For me, I really wanted all these people who are defining the policy of the future about how robots and how machines relate to us to begin to think about the new challenges of machines that have decentralized minds that outnumber us, what they can actually do and how they might behave. So Manus is a set of 10 industrial robots that are programmed to behave like a pack of animals. And we have this assembly line of machines here that even though they all move individually, their minds are not inside their bodies. There's one mind, one computer that controls all 10 robots here. And that results in this pretty incredible rippling of behaviors that sort of resonate through the pack as a person walks by. So the robots in Manus are particularly nearsighted. So the sensors are not in the ceiling, seeing a whole wide range. They're in the floor looking up at you. And that's to sort of bring you in close and to help you kind of feel surrounded by these machines. And so, like all of the robots that I do, we immediately think that they're seeing us through their snout. But those are really just bolt patterns that happen. And an amazing affordance of machines is that their sensors and their brains don't need to be inside their bodies. They can experience the world in a completely different way than we do. for the robots in Manus, they're looking for sort of markers of our own body language, where our heads are, where the hand is, how close we are, how low we're moving down. And the robots themselves can begin to pick and choose, just like Mimas, who to go look at and who to ignore. That all gets fed into this kinematic software. All of this is, again, I should mention, is built in Open Frameworks, which is an open source C++ coding environment, where it really helps me make my own tools to ask things to do things that they're not supposed to do. And it was an incredible experience to see these kind of powerful people in their business suits begin to come up to the robots and expect them to behave and mirror them when they put their hands up. And then the robots kind of lose interest and go check out their underlings on the side. And what's important for me with this piece in particular is to show that even if these machines don't look like us or don't act like us, that they can still connect with us in meaningful ways. So with my machines, I really try to tease out poetic experiences from pragmatic technology. And there's a core truth to all of these installations, all these interactions that I do with robots, is that if these machines are going to share our cities, our streets, and our skies, then they need to be more than just useful, right? They need to be meaningful contributors to our everyday lives. As artists and designers, I feel like it's our responsibility to choose how we use this technology and how not to use this technology, and to do things that are showing that there's more than just efficiency and utility from this technology. And it's very endearing that I'm not alone in thinking about this future for machines. So when we think about robots as creatures, my work sort of sits in a continuum of a lot of people kind of thinking about what the future of machines could be. Probably starting with Golan 11 is one of my favorite projects. So this might not look like a robotics project, but it is. This is called Snout, or Double Taker. It's a big, giant industrial robot mounted to the roof of a gallery with a garbage bag and a googly eye on the end of it. And I find it pretty spectacular. Right, so he's using a computer vision system here to identify where people are and just have this big kind of character go look at them. And that's it, and it's delightful, and that's all it really needs to be, right? Thinking about robots not as tools of automation, but as something that begins to exist with us in the shared space. Rory Glynn is another architect / designer / artist doing amazing things with robots. This project, Fearful Symmetry, was at the Tate in 2012, and it's a Delta robot that has this beacon of light that sort of goes around this dark space and kind of beckons people to come closer. Again, thinking about this robot as this presence that begins to engage and interact with us. And then this project by Random International, called Zoological, is really, really delightful. It's one of my favorite projects out there, right? There's a lot of drones and entertainment that are happening and going on to shows, and drones, thinking about drones as like this digital fireworks that go out into the sky. What I love about what these guys did is that they made their own drone, this floaty thing with this light little hum that begins to swarm and flock around the people below them. So those are all examples, and my own work is this kind of same body of work of thinking of robots as creatures and that they kind of coexist with us. But there's also this future, a very, very real future, of robots that just exist in the world, completely independent of this. And this project by Masoud Hassani, I think, speaks towards that. So this is all analog. It's not necessarily a robot by the finest definition, but it's this big thing that can begin to clear minefields, for example. It gets pushed out into dangerous areas and it takes the hit for the mine. Theo Janssen's work with his Strand Beast that has been going on for decades now also kind of fits into this genre of thinking of robots as creatures and not things, right? So here, these mechanisms are released onto a beachside in the Netherlands, and they begin to just exist and respond to their environment while also hopefully tamping down the beach and preventing erosion. This next theme I want us to talk about are robots as collaborators. And this is one of the things that I think artists really trend towards as well. I picked a couple of examples that I really am fond of, but even going back to the 1960s with these original engagements of artists and engineers, shows in cybernetic serendipity and experiments in art and technology, there's people thinking not just about these machines as tools, but as a contributor to their artistic practice. And I think that Soo-Gwon Chung and Doug, her drawing apparatus here, Drawing Operation Unit Generation 3, are a great example of that. So Soo-Gwon is a visual artist that begins to collaborate with her robot using a bunch of artificial intelligence and machine learning systems to help the robot begin to respond to her input, and she in turn responds to the robot's input. And she's done this on a number of scales with a number of machines. And what's wonderful about this is that, again, because these robots don't see the world like we do, we can begin to have them generate and move based on different things. So this set of robots is actually responding to live data from New York that's being streamed in, and that's affecting their flow patterns as they move around the canvas, which again begins to affect how Soo-Gwon is moving. And then this next piece by Adi Wagenknecht, Alone Together, are a series of mechanically assisted paintings. So again, this is a very traditional fine arts tradition for paint on canvas, but really indispensable without the use of a machine. So here what we see is a bunch of blue splotches and a bunch of void splotches. And the way that Adi is making this is that she's actually working with a Roomba to begin to move paint around her. And where she is sitting on the canvas, it begins to avoid her, right? So she's leaving sort of the void of the feminine in her actual artwork in a quite literal way, right? Because this Roomba that's doing all the mechanical labor is using its algorithm to sort of bump against her and move around. Okay, so this next theme that I want to share is thinking about robots as extensions of the body. And this to me is really an exciting area, right? We think of prosthetics and we think of technology in general as ways of overcoming human limitations. And there's a couple examples of artists that I think are doing this to an amazing ability. Starting with Dragan Illich. This is a pretty wild project. It kind of blew my mind when I saw it for the first time, right? So here we are, we have this painter who is really limited in the range that they can move, right? And instead of using an industrial robot for automation to sort of replicate what he does, he begins to use it as an extension of his own body, right? Now all of a sudden, his artwork can begin to possess a canvas that is 5 meters long, and that begin to have the signature and the movement of how that robot is moving to. So I would encourage you guys to look at his work. His Robo Action series goes all the way back to 2004. There's a lot of great examples there, and also wonderful performances. And then as extensions of the body, you really can't escape the idea of robotic wearables. And what I love about Behnaz Farahi's work is that she is thinking about robotic wearables as an extension of our sensory experience of the world. Not only what we intake, but how it projects back out into the world and affects the people around us. So this is one of her latest pieces from this year, and it has these 200 rotating quills to make this interactive collar. And there's a camera integrated, and it's looking for facial expressions to begin to have this collar begin to flutter. A really incredible body of work that if you're interested, I encourage you to go do a deep dive. Okay, so this last theme I want to share is thinking about robots as dynamic environments. So not just occupants are environments, not collaborators, not part of us, but just as the environment itself. And if you were at Sonar a couple years ago, maybe you got to experience this from Rhizomatics, Phosphere, which is a series of robotic projectors and mirrors that begin to engage with the person itself, right? So here the robots are creating the entire atmosphere of space. One of the leaders in architectural robotics, thinking about how robots make space and how make forms and structures in space, is Gramazio Kohler Research. And this is one of their lesser known projects, but it's one of my favorite, called Material Depositions. So what you're seeing here is a long form photograph of a robot shooting off pellets of clay to slowly grow an architectural space. And what's great about this is that I think it's a really clever way to get around the limitations of a robot. So here we have this little tiny robot that can only lift about 5 kilograms, and yet it's shooting off this clay to make this huge space, right? And you can imagine that with a little more work, that you could begin to have people walking around and a maze, forming around you as you walk. I love this project. And this is the last project I want to show to you today. This is by also an architect and designer, Maria Jablonina. And what I love about her work is that she sort of bridges the boundaries between robots as creatures and robots as dynamic environments. So here, she has this system of robots that begin to weave a structure by interacting with each other. So there's these wall-crawling robots that will go up a wall, a line-crawling robot that will pass the line, and these things will start to, like spiders, begin to make this carbon fiber net around you without any sort of human intervention. And she has a lot of really interesting work that is similar to this. So to wrap up thinking about our preferable futures, there's many, many possible futures for us and machines. And I talked about 4 themes that seem to be emerging, but there's many, many more out there. And so we've seen examples from a number of designers, and so I want to encourage you to go check out the rest of their body of work, since these are really just snippets of what they're doing. And I think in general that artists and designers are really well equipped to work on the edge of what's possible, sort of innate to the artistic practice to begin to bump the norm and look towards fringe or different applications of existing technology. We're really, really good at misusing things. And so I'm hoping that all of us in this room can sort of begin to contribute towards pushing the centroid of what's probable towards what's preferred and making these weird and wonderful futures with machines. Okay, so before the open Q&A, I thought I'd leave you with a couple of resources, things that when making this talk I found really useful. And starting with this idea of the Mechanical Turk. Has anyone done Mechanical Turk for Amazon before? Hidden infrastructure of all artificial intelligence was paying people pennies to label data. This is a great article from IEEE about how Amazon sort of took this idea from the 18th century, modernized it, and was kind of influential in it becoming its giant that it is today. And then if you're curious a little bit more about domestic robots and iRobot in particular, there's 2 great articles. One from VentureBeat talking about iRobot's history from military funding to domestic corporate home products. And this one from the New York Times is also really interesting. Right, and for those of you who own a Roomba, I really encourage you to read it, talking about how much data that little device actually has and how opaque the use of that data is and how that might be important to you. And then social robots, these robots have a particular place in my heart, and it's been really challenging because they've struggled. A lot of the best and most interesting and most beloved social robot companies have recently gone under. And so this article from The Verge really talks about the people that are left behind once the servers get shut off on a social robot. It's a really interesting article, long-form article, that I found endearing. In terms of books, this is the catalog for cybernetic serendipity. It's such an interesting snapshot of where we were in the 1960s and 1970s. And you can find a PDF version of it online. One of my favorite books, also very formative of how I saw the world, is from Ila Norbekos, called Robot Futures. Ila is a roboticist at Carnegie Mellon. Super interesting guy. This is probably the thinnest book he's ever written. And it's a really interesting look into his mind about how he sees our futures with machines and some of the complications of that. And then if you're interested in thinking about what role designers and architects had in forming what artificial intelligence is today, I highly recommend Molly Steenson's book. This came out fairly recently, called Architectural Intelligence. Okay, I think we're doing pretty well on time. We have about 20 minutes to have an open Q&A and an open discussion. So what I would like to do is, I've been up here talking a lot, and so I would like to hit pause for a little bit and have you guys chat with each other why you're here, what you're thinking about. There's been a lot of information up here. And one, it's a good way to get to know your neighbor, but also let's take like 3 or 5 minutes to just think about it rather than bombarding me with questions. Does that sound good? Yeah? Uh-huh. Thank you. So in 3 minutes, we'll do an open Q&A, but talk to each other and think about like what ideas are interesting and what's weird. So we have 2 mics here. We have 2 mics here that we can pass around. And I just want to hear, what are these exciting conversations that you're having? Why don't you share them with the group?
Hi, thank you for the talk, really interesting. I'm Fernando Drummond from Telefonica Alpha. And I was thinking, like during your talk, because now with learning techniques, we are going from coding the robots to do exactly what you tell them to do, to robots learning to take their own decisions. So I would like to hear your opinion on how could you think of the accountability in the future if a robot hurts someone, if they damage someone's property, or even if think that robots might end up breaking the laws through the decisions that they are making. Like who's responsible for that, and who or what could we hold accountable for that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, right? So thinking about kind of not just the legal issues, but the ethical issues of machines that are actually out in the world with us and sometimes like we're encapsulated inside of, right? For an autonomous car, for example, right? Are humans just the insurance nugget inside that vehicle to take liability if there's an issue? In Pittsburgh, there's a lot of autonomous car companies that are beginning to test on Pittsburgh's roads. It's an issue that really comes up a lot. There's no good answers. That's where we are today, right? And policymakers are still grappling with those issues there. I think that there's lots of potential problematic issues with machines that we begin to put too much trust into. I think as designers and as artists, there's things that we can do to help communicate better with these machines that don't look like us and don't act like us. So like in this example here, this robot looks intelligent, but if a person was inside the enclosure, it would be incredibly dangerous for them, and they might not come out of that enclosure, right? So having this is one layer of responsibility as a designer to put those safety measures in control. There are things that we can do to help non-humanoid machines. So you can think about the delivery robots that are on the sidewalk, for example. They could also run over a child, right? Children don't tend to be in the training data for that you gather in a lab environment for these machines. You can begin to leave cues, leave breadcrumbs and hints behind for how what that robot is about to do just by how it moves. That's at least the way that I approach a lot of my work. So a lot of these robots, they can move very fast, very quickly and do sharp, accurate turns, but actually leaving imperfections for a robot to turn a corner, for example, begins to signal to the other people around it what it's about to do. So there are design strategies that can begin to combat some of the alienness of living side by side with these things.
Thank you.
That's a great question. Yeah, Mia.
Hi. So you have talked a lot the artworks that the artists working with the robots or creating robot artwork. And I'm wondering also that there's also another side that the robots took over the artists' jobs. That, recent that in New York at auctions, the first robot-made painting was sold like $500,000 US, and they create also like robot artists. And we all know that there are so many artists suffering in the world, and they try to get like $1,000 US for their work to sell. And then you see also that the artwork made by robot was sold almost like $1 million US. So I'm wondering, like, what do you feel about this side?
Yeah, that's something that the art world has grappled with all throughout this mechanization of artwork, right? It's from, even photography had that same issue at the very beginning, right? We take a picture, but the machine is doing the work, and that's the labor compared to painting was a kind of a common argument in the early 20th century for why is photography artwork. I think what you find, even, if we use photography as that metaphor, since we're all kind of familiar with it, there's a machine that's doing the labor, but the eye and the perspective is really from the person behind that machine. And that holds true for a lot of these robotically made artworks. That not only the labor that goes into the concept of it, but the actual authorship is a lot more heavy-handed oftentimes than like pressing a button and art comes out. There's not yet an art button machine. You can see that is like the robot that is the author or is contributed somewhat as an author is not the entity that got paid for that. Other people, humans got paid during the sale of that thing. So I think there's a live and well future for artists to begin to think about these machines as collaborators or them as the curator of what these machines produce. There's a lot of great work out here. Memo Atkin is actually exhibited here. He's an amazing artist that uses artificial intelligence as a primary medium, right? And that's really where the best work of the artists are not thinking of it as a tool, they're thinking about it as a medium itself, a means of expression itself, and they're taking deep dives into that.
I just bridged from the previous question, talking about robots, talking about complexity and the cost of this kind of technology. Let me think about us 1 year ago, or all those people, those foundation NGOs or whatever that do not have the luck to have this kind of connections. How do you see possible to hack this business constraint to make robotics more democratic, to make it more affordable for the early artists, for the early curators, and anyone that has no good connection or good, let's say, money?
That's a great question. And so this machine, just to put it in context, I think is like $200,000 US, right? So I had to beg and borrow and steal the machine to actually begin to do something with what they kindly call an artwork with it. That's a constant struggle in my own work, even having done a series of these projects there. And what you see is that a lot of the people that I mentioned, they were affiliated with a university and got access to those resources through a university, which in itself is still a very privileged position to be in. One of the wonderful things that has been happening, and one of the reasons why it's possible to come from the arts and sort of begin to transfer and bring your perspective into robotics and engineering, is because a lot of the knowledge has democratized. For me, I learned programming in a course, but I also had all these online tools that would help me in these online communities. I participate in open source software and open source hardware that begins to share knowledge back from the sources that I gained. And with hardware in particular, you have great open source platforms like Arduino, for example, that is being taught in libraries, in public spaces, and in high schools and middle schools, at least in the US. There's been a lot of education towards that. For me, the challenge is that there seems to be a bit of a gap. Like if you are under 16 years old, you might actually get that in your education now. And if you are going to a good university, you might get that, and you might have access to education. But there's a gap kind of in between that and after that for tools and knowledge to come to play. Hopefully there's municipal programs like libraries that come into a community and enable them with some of the tools and technology for innovation and changing their own environments.
I have another question here, this side. Now, there was any specifics why you choose a so bigger machine? Because, as you show in the other projects, there is smaller machines, and there is there is a very important research being done here in Barcelona for dressing and feeding you. That they are also like machines. Does your impact was more towards bigger machines, or?
Yeah, I think for me, coming from an architecture background, I'm very sensitive to space, and using these big machines, there's a spatial relationship that you have that's very overwhelming when this thing is so much larger than you. And that was definitely in my own artwork something I wanted to play with and help people kind of experience being very small in front of them. In terms of practicality, industrial robots really won't find a place in the home. What's far more likely and what's actually happening is like what you're saying, are these assistive robots that are more compliant. So if this machine doesn't see you, it sort of goes right through you. And because you're soft, squishy flesh and it's hardened steel, it will always win and you will always lose. But things like the Canova arm, let's see here. Yeah, these are great examples. So things like the Canova arm here are an assistive technology, and they are designed from the hardware itself and the software. Not only the hardware is designed to be delicate around people, and the software is designed to be usable by people. Whereas the machines that I work with, you really have to, they guard that knowledge, and you have to try to infiltrate in order to get the knowledge to use it. And so soft robots, like wearable robots and these exoskeletons, are another thing that people are exploring. So if you guys have seen the Disney movie Big Hero 6, anyone? So it has this big inflatable robot. That is based on real research coming out of Carnegie Mellon from Chris Atkinson that is thinking about how we use inflated and textiles as this more malleable, human-safe material to build machines.
Okay, so about 6 months ago, I read a piece of news saying that some bots owned by Facebook that I believe were used like for internal purposes were beginning to communicate each other and to learn via each other. Mm-hmm. To me, it seemed like a clickbait news, so I didn't care much about it, but I would like to ask if this could be possible, that a group of robots capable actually of learning something new could learn via one to each other.
That's a great question. I think the Facebook example was software bots. But for hardware bots, and I've been thinking about this a lot in my own work, there's plenty of examples in nature where things that are different species can still communicate and coexist with another. So we have these, for example, symbiotic relationships between a hermit crab that will take a sea anemone and put it on its shell and walk around. And now the sea anemone has a food source, all the prey for the hermit crab, and the hermit crab has protection. I think for robots that are coming out here, we see one type of machine that's sort of coming out into the world. But when we're littered with all sorts of companies and all sorts of machines, that there might be an opportunity for these symbiotic relationships to actually happen. So not necessarily communication in the way that we do, but you can imagine a drone, a delivery drone that has to go further than its battery would allow, might hitch a ride on a self-driving car for a bit and then take off and lift. And in exchange, maybe that drone gives mapping data to the self-driving car that it lands on. So there could be some communication exchange that's mutually beneficial in a decentralized way. I think is kind of an interesting possible future that we have.
I don't know if a question, maybe more of a comment. I see most of robot installations for the last 10 years and all the artwork you guys are doing is always with new robots. I see comments like the gentleman over there saying like the access to robots are very difficult. But in the other hand, me myself, I tend to see full hangars and like buildings full of old robots. All those videos you're showing about like automobile plants, welding and so on, all those robots are legacy.
Yes.
I wonder, or maybe this is my own push, is how can we actually retrofit all those robots into new usage? Because all those robots, I guess most of us, we have this image of iRobot, the movie where there was like this
everything's very shiny, very white, very
But
slick.
you had also these, how do you say, like the garbage, where you had all the old robots.
Uh-huh.
This is already now.
Yes, yeah.
Accessibility to all robots is super cheap. I'm saying super cheap, okay, I mean, everything is relative, but...
And sustainable. as well.
Sustainable,
Right.
because they are laying somewhere, nobody's using them, but nobody's really doing anything new with them. So I don't know what the responsibility of art or of new technology is towards this.
That was actually my first robot that I got to use was something that was given away to the university because it was past its end of life, and it didn't even have a USB drive. It had floppy disks, so we had to go into the controller and wire in a USB drive so that we had something modern to it. But that's something that's a very hot topic, especially where the region where I'm based right now, in the Midwest in the United States, because a lot of the manufacturing that was there, that's been there since the 1960s, has sort of gone overseas, but you still have these warehouses and these legacy of manufacturing there. And so there is a lot of work, not only to retrofit the robots to be more usable to today, which could just be adding a couple technology, but also retrofitting those robots for uses and needs that are there in those local environments. So a friend of mine, for example, Josh Bard, a really talented researcher at Carnegie Mellon, he's working with a local plaster union. These are the people that make plaster walls that predated drywall. And plaster has basically been completely annihilated by drywall, which is this mass production system of pooping out pulp into a sheet on a big factory floor. And what he's trying to do is to have the robot act as an apprentice to those plasterers so that they can begin to have some economic and competitive advantage to mechanize part of their work. So their artistic craft, for example, is what they still do, but all the hard labor and repetitive labor the robot still does. You're 100% correct, and this is a kind of another way to begin to have robots be useful and meaningful in these places where manufacturing has left, but the infrastructure, the skeleton of the infrastructure is still there in those places.
My question is, do you see any limits about what robots can do, or can robots do any job humans do? Or my second question would be, what shouldn't robots be taught that shouldn't be?
I think that's a great question, right? So not what can robots do, or can robots do everything, but what should robots do? Should robots do everything? And that I think is where, as a society, we've really yet to decide. So one area that I can think of that is where I think that robots could do it but are totally not necessary is often with caretaking. So when you get sick and you have a person look after you, or when you have limited mobility or a disability and you have someone look after you, there's a lot of work in robotics to make those assistive tools. But at the same time, I think that the human interaction and care is something that is hard to automate. It's something that people are very good at. And a lot of the challenge that we see in labor shortages is because the people who are doing those jobs don't get paid enough. And so that's why people are looking towards automation. There are some areas and industries where robotics could have an impact, but perhaps it's better for people to just do it more often. There's questions of that also in construction, right? So construction offers a lot of low skill jobs and money. There's a lot of ways for example, a big bulldozer could begin to clear a site of dirt and make it flat. Or should you hire 100 people in a developing country to begin to dig and do that? So, and automated construction equipment is in a whole nother area that is rapidly gaining traction as well. It's a good question, right? What should we use robots for? Not what could we? Because we could use robots for anything, really.
I'd like to follow up on the story of the old robots. Mm-hmm. Old robots are dumber, I think. They have less intelligence. As artists, we hack into robots, so they are maybe an easier starting point to get started with robots. Now we see that robots are becoming more advanced. Are they becoming more closed, proprietary? Is it becoming more difficult to tap into the new technologies, and is it still accessible? How do you see the evolution of that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And so talking about older robots as well as accessibility issues, both financially, I think the trend over time is that when a new piece of technology comes out, and this is, I think, true across all media arts, not just robotics, when a new piece of technology comes out that's really, really expensive, there's not a lot of people hacking it or using it. And as that technology comes down in costs, the risk of potentially breaking it, or even just the access to afford it, it becomes lower, and more people begin to explore alternative uses for it. So with robotics and industrial robotics, like, yeah, they're really great because you can get one that is 10 years old for 10 cents on the dollar, and who cares if you ask it to do a weird thing, right? It doesn't need to have that return on investment that, for example, maybe a good example of that is the quadrupeds that are coming out, right? This is a really, really interesting technology that only now, so the Spot Mini platform is a very closed environment, and they kind of want you to use it how they want you to use it. But there's a lot of open source projects that are coming out now. MIT has one called the Cheetah, which is you can build it yourself as a walking robot. And it's still very, very expensive, right? It still might be $20,000 to actually build it and use it, and you need a lot of knowledge to use it. But I think that there'll be more experimentation from that platform than from this one. So I'm very pro open source for both hardware and software, because it does bring down the cost, and it does open up the knowledge barriers beyond just the cost of it. All right, well, thank you guys so much for chatting with me and staying with me. I'm happy to continue the conversation. I'll be here later. I'm here all day. And thank you so much for the time.